Hello, I'm John, also known as the Arcade Mage on the Well-Read Mages website. And so here is my entry for the Game Room World Tour. And while most of the video game stuff I have is currently in storage, I wanted to highlight and share some of the, I suppose, gems of my collection or collections within the collection. And in addition to the Video Game World Tour, right behind you is where I typically do most of my video editing, as well as working on articles for the Well-Read Mages website. And so, without further ado, I want to show you some of the amazing things, or at least things I think are amazing, in my video game collection. So the first thing on this tour I would like to walk you through is my nearly complete library of Virtual Boy games. And I got my Virtual Boy in the early 2000s, and as you all know, the Virtual Boy was released in 1994 and 1995 before being quickly discontinued. However, when I looked at Nintendo's website, because where the controller plugged into the system, the port itself had gone up in the system, and at that time there were no specialized screw bits available on eBay for me to purchase to be able to fix it myself, I found out that Nintendo of America was actually still repairing Virtual Boys into the 2000s. And so I ended up spending about $70 to ship my Virtual Boy off and get it repaired. And I imagine that Nintendo had plenty of spare parts hanging around because I essentially got a brand new Virtual Boy for my troubles. I imagine the repairman had to dust off a box of manuals to figure out how to work on this. And so it is potentially one of the last Virtual Boys to be repaired by Nintendo of America. And for those of you that don't know, it takes a Super Nintendo plug, and the way the system is powered is a bit unconventional in that the plug itself goes plugged into this device right here. And then you take this device and then you plug it into the back of the controller. And then the controller gets plugged into the system. And so essentially the Virtual Boy itself was powered through the controller. And additionally, you also had a battery pack you could utilize if you wanted to take your Virtual Boy on the go. And pretty much at this point, I am only missing two of the most expensive Virtual Boy games. Virtual Bowling, which is essentially the Japanese version of Nestor's Funky Bowling, and Virtua Lab, which is a virtual 3D sort of Tetris, but also more Dr. Mario puzzler. And so pretty much I'm just kind of waiting to find a good copy of both games online for a hopefully somewhat reasonable price. And so some of the more interesting ones is Innsmouth no Yokata, which is essentially similar to some of the early RPGs in the day, or Doom, or Return to Castle Wolfenstein. It's a survival horror to where it's a first-person sort of adventure slash shooter slash RPG. In addition to that, you have Space Invaders, SD Gundam Dimension War, which is a tactical RPG on the Virtual Boy, and Virtual Fishing, Space Squatch, which is a sports game. And pretty much at this point, most of the cartridges you see here before you are the US releases and the Japanese releases. Now, some of the US releases, like Nestor's Funky Bowling, for example, would be Virtual Bowling. And some games were released in Japan but not released over here, such as most of the ones over here. In addition to that, I've actually been collecting all the homebrews that get a physical release as well. And I even got a flashcard from the United Kingdom. If I ever want to upload English translated ROMs and play them on my Virtual Boy, I can do that. In addition to that, I have a few items of Virtual Boy, I guess, errata. You have a deck of playing cards and also the official earbuds. And my passion for the Virtual Boy dovetails nicely into one of my more current passions in the, I suppose, history of console-based virtual reality, and that is the PlayStation VR. And essentially this summer I kind of decided, after having a number of VR games, to kind of start collecting it because I enjoyed collecting the Virtual Boy, and I figured I would try and get in on the ground floor. And so pretty much at the moment I've got my PlayStation VR, quite a few of the physical releases. I got the Gungrave VR Complete Edition from Japan, and the reason it's so big is because it has a vinyl record inside of it. Picked up a number of promo discs from Europe, and I've also been collecting a number of PlayStation VR memorabilia, including stuff from shows, stuff given to Sony executives, stuff that comes with special editions, clothing, press kit, and I've also been trolling eBay for other stuff as well. And I would be remiss if I didn't highlight my Harvest Moon video game collection, because Harvest Moon as a series is one I have enjoyed a whole lot growing up, even though the more recent entries in the series after Natsume and the parent company that developed the Harvest Moon series split haven't been good at all. I still really enjoy the classic Harvest Moon games, like on the Super Nintendo, the PlayStation, the Game Boy Advance, and the original Game Boy. And admittedly, I have Stardew Valley as my Harvest Moon fix from now until the end of time, or at least until Harvest Moon gets another legitimately decent game. And I would like to get more Harvest Moon memorabilia, but with pretty much every Harvest Moon release, they released a stuffed animal that came with it if you pre-ordered it, and those typically go for $20 to $50 a piece, and I just don't have that kind of money to buy stuffed animals with. Maybe one day, but not now. And this is probably one of the crown jewels in my video game collection, because this game is one of the fabled Atari 2600 games from the Alamogordo landfill dump, when back in 1982 or 83, no one's really quite sure on the date, Atari dumped thousands of Atari 2600 games that went unsold, buried them in the middle of the desert, bulldozed it over, covered it in concrete, and tried to wipe it from existence. This, of course, is perhaps most notoriously known because of the E.T. 2600 games that never really sold. However, more than just E.T. was buried in the Alamogordo dump, and essentially years later, after decades of rumors flying about whether or not these games existed, they finally dug up the Alamogordo dump and found the hidden cache of 2600 games. A lot of them went to museums, but a small selection of games went up on eBay. Unfortunately, at the time, I could not pay the prices that an ET cartridge was commanding. However, I got a complete in-box game of Missile Command, and it's probably the most expensive piece of trash I've ever paid for to this point. And I guess to answer your question ahead of time, yes, it smells very bad. It smells like a dump. And no, I actually haven't tested it. I probably should one day, but I like to leave that mystery alive. Furthermore, this game means a lot to me because it really represents a lot of passions I have in life. One, this is an object of video game history. In addition to that, well, it's a piece of trash as well. But I have a passion for video game history. I have a passion for video games, their impact in culture. And I also study a lot of archaeology in my undergraduate program, and I have a passion, and always have had a passion, for archaeology, even up to, when I was a small child watching Indiana Jones and DuckTales. And to give you a greater emphasis on that, here is some of the dirt that came in the bag from the Alamogordo dump. And so I will leave it here, and hopefully the smell-o-vision is working so you can smell history. And all of these passions, the passion for video game history, the impact of video games on culture, video game culture itself, as well as archiving and preserving and documenting video game artifacts and ensuring that they are there for future generations, has all been the driving vehicle for the Arcade Castle. Because with the Arcade Castle, both the website and the podcast, I try to look at the decades-long history of video game licensed board games. Looking at Dragon's Lair, for example, looking at the history of Dragon's Lair, the impact of Dragon's Lair on video game culture, and then looking at the board game for Dragon's Lair. How does a designer take essentially a laser disc operated video game that is essentially a series of quick time events and an early example of the runner genre and turn that into a board game? In what ways can you turn it into a board game? And we look at the board game and its mechanics and how the user interacts with it and compares it to its video game source and sees whether it succeeds or fails, as well as any improvements that can be made. How well does it capture the essence of Dragon's Lair? And so the plan is to, over time, preserve and archive these video game board games for future generations and try and let people know that they exist and that they deserve to be talked about and remembered. Without further ado, I want to thank you for checking out my video game collection and my video game room world tour. I invite you to check out the Well-Read Mage's website. It not only has a number of articles from me on there, but also from a lot of other talented writers and editors. And I recommend checking out not only the Well-Read Mage's website, but also each of the individual writers and their own personal projects that they are working on right now. Also, I invite you to check out my podcast and website. The Arcade Castle podcast is available on www.arcadecastle.com. And as always, I thank you for watching. And I would be remiss if I didn't introduce you to one of the Meowiers of Light, Belle, who turned 17 a couple of weeks ago. And yes, I had to give her treats so she would stand still. And now that she's out of treats, she is currently on the move. Hi, Belle. Say hello to the internet. I guess that's good enough.